Fortunate to have Therese Moriarty to speak with us on the theme of women workers in the revolutionary period. Therese has written extensively on women in the labour and trade union movement in the early part of the 20th century. She's an historian, a lecturer and an official of the Irish Labour History Society. And we're delighted to have her here for the event this evening. Welcome, Therese. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to say many thanks. I'm delighted to be asked. I found it a lot more challenging, really, to kind of come up with a lot of the data and information that I should have done. Partly because, it's access is quite difficult during this period, but I've kind of relied to some extent on some of the background work that I would have done on the Irish trade union movement and women generally as well. So I hope there's something enough there for everybody. Tucked away in all the statistics and the surveys of the national workforce 100 years ago are numbers that show that for the first time the largest group of women workers in the country were in manufacturing industries and not in the domestic service, which was the traditional place that women worked for decades. 20th century Irish women were moving from the privacy of households into a busy public world of factories, shops and offices. And here in Waterford, in the most visible, political sense, women workers led the May Day procession, and their organiser, Helena Flowers, was one of the speakers on the platform. And this was a really radical new step in the working class culture of Waterford, but also in the country. Women rarely had sort of, except in their own cause and suffrage, rarely had a stand on public platforms. And this kind of, these events, of course, would have been the work of the city's Trades Council. Before looking closer at the challenges and the changes in the years of revolution, I just want to take a quick backward glance and sort of get a bearings of what we're talking about. Before the war, most women in Waterford, the city and the county, worked overwhelmingly as domestics. I mean, it's just kind of absolutely true of most counties as well. Others in smaller numbers were the women that worked in the clothing industry, the dressmakers and the seamstresses. And there were plenty of sales assistants. There were national school teachers. There was a handful of music teachers, and some were a small but significant group of white-collar workers who were pointing really to the future of women's employment: the clerks, the accountants, the typists, and a stenographer. And of course, sales work covers the various occupations. There were newsagents and tobacconist sales workers, publicans and barmaids, grocers and stationers and drapers' assistants in the big stores, where they were also quite often apprenticed as the draperies. Domestic servants, of course, were also included a range of occupations. So you could be a housekeeper or a housemaid, a cook or a kitchen maid, a nurse or a governess, a washerwoman or a charwoman. Not all domestic workers worked indoors, or lived indoors, I should say, in the house. Some of them were daily workers. And surprising numbers of households in those days employed women coming in as some form of domestic worker. Waterford had a number of factories where women worked: the bag factory, the bacon factory, the boot factory, the pipe factory, and a sack factory. And again, these workers could be machinists or weavers, spinners and winders, all quite kind of skilled work, many of them from the different categories of textile production. And since we're looking at the work that women did, I might just include the only lady doctor in the city, and I think actually one of the only doctors in the city, the suffrage campaigner Mary Strangman, who was one of only 2 women councillors elected in the country before the First World War. Few, if any, of these occupations were unionised. Either the groups of workers were too small, working on their own, or considered just too difficult to organise. Unions tended to see women workers as a problem. Women domestic workers doing domestic work or in shops and especially in factories were always very young. Their social, economic and cultural lives were governed by family codes and customs of parental and even patriarchal authority. Young workers frequently followed another family member into a job where a trusted worker's recommendation of a relative was usually accepted sooner than a formal reference. Family custom and tradition might even determine whether a young woman was a trade union member or not. In Belfast, both Mary Galway, who was Ireland's first full-time woman trade union official, and James Connolly understood the importance of family links among their union members. Galway felt that trade union men didn't encourage trade unionism among their daughters in the same way that they did with their sons. The low wages of young women workers, no matter how small, all contributed to a household income. They were very rarely independent earners. So any decision to take part in industrial action at work would become maybe a family and not an individual decision. Emmett O'Connor, the historian of Waterford's labour history, has explained how the war between 1914 and 1918 drove the events, not just over those years, but in the aftermath too. The war had opened a great fissure in Irish life. The country was shattered by war and rebellion, and Ireland's labour movement was devastated by the deaths and executions, the military arrests, imprisonment, internment, and the seizure of records in the Dublin Rising. And of course that kind of practice would continue through into the War of Independence, so that unions were very often left bereft of their records after a serious raid, and this affected their daily their daily work and organisation greatly. And it shouldn't really, it probably should be written up probably a bit more about just the sheer difficulties of those years of during the revolutionary period. A British trade union journal pointed out that the position of women workers in Dublin in particular had not had the attention it deserves in the Rising, and pointed out that the Irish Women Workers' Union had to bear the share of its loss. During the war, Irish politicians in Westminster lobbied strongly for Ireland to share in the war contracts of the British government, especially in munition production, and the national shell factories opened here in Ireland in 1917. Cork, Dublin, Galway and Waterford all had munition works, where the workforce by regulation had to be 95% women. Obviously they wanted the men to join up and fight. In Waterford, the factory opened in Bilberry on the site of the old South Waterford railway station that had been closed a decade before. A dozen women, all named, and I managed to leave the names at home, but I found them on the site of the Waterford's County Council, were sent to Britain for training for this work. And after Dublin, which had two factories, Waterford had by far the largest number of munition workers in the country. These factories were followed by a new British union, the National Federation of Women Workers, who represented the munition workers in Britain. The Federation launched in Ireland in May 1917 with the Irish women's suffrage campaigner, Mary Hayden, the Professor of History in UCD, with the aim to raise Irish munition wages to the same level as in Britain. At the end of the war, Irish munition workers were counted as about 800 in Dublin, maybe up to about 1,000 in the two factories, but there was over 500 employed in the Waterford factory. The Cork and Galway were much smaller, like 150 or 115 in Galway. Most Irish munition workers, in fact, obviously worked over in Britain because there was a great attraction in the very badly paid work at home. The British wages in munitions were good, and you get people complaining that, in fact, they couldn't keep workers here because so many were leaving for the munition factories in Britain. In 1918, when the Women's Federation was preparing to leave Ireland, they congratulated themselves in their journal. We were, they said, instrumental in raising the standard of wages for the whole of women's labour in Ireland, and we had enabled the industrial women for the first time in Irish history to approximate to an equality of economic position with the men. The Federation had built branches of other workers, especially in the woolen industry, but in others as well. And wartime trade unionism had made women in both the new and traditional industries a highly visible part of the workforce for the first time. These were the women, the Women's Federation women, who headed the Waterford May Day marches with their banners and their speakers at this time. In 1919, the Federation members marched in May Day parades in Cork, Dublin, Galway and Wexford, as well as in Waterford. The Federation apparently, because they had only come to Ireland for the duration of the war, never affiliated with the Irish trade union movement nationally, but obviously in cities like Waterford had good relations with other unions where they had a number of branches. And you could see that in the May Day, the fact that they had speakers at the May Day on the May Day platform. In 1819, they transferred all their branches and the Federation organiser, who then was Margaret Buckley, to the Irish Women Workers' Union, which had been revived in February 1917. Louise Bennett recalled that she was asked, this was for the second time, to help organise women workers in January 1917. James Connolly and Helena Maloney had approached her in 1915 to help. The reorganised Women Workers' Union had a new structure with Madame Markowitz as the president, an acting president who was Mary Perraults, who had been a trusted envoy of the Irish Citizen Army and had travelled to Waterford to give the news about the rising in Dublin. Louise Bennett was one of 7 vice presidents. There were 6 executives, 2 treasurers and a general secretary, Helena Maloney, who was still working as an actress at that stage and had only just been released from prison. And the clerk of the union was Rosie Hackett, who you may have heard of through the bridge in Dublin that was opened there a few years ago. Bennett targeted women print workers. We had extraordinary success and I got the women in the print industry organised, she said. The Women's Union had a Waterford branch from its very earliest year of registration, which was from 1918, not only among the munition workers, but they also had looked at print workers. There were a good number of kind of book stitchers and women who worked in that sort of category of in the print shops who weren't in the old sort of typographical societies. And so they were starting to organise into their own union branches. So they had hoped that there would be a Waterford print workers branch for women. In 1918, there were 8 branches of the Women Workers' Union. The Waterford branch survived then until 1921, when the Dublin Union really at that stage was beginning to be all that was left. And the Waterford organiser was Miss McCarthy, and her address was given as 40 Thomas Street, but so far I haven't really been able to get exactly what her name was or much more about her. If anybody here knows, I'd be interested to hear. When the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party, they were just about to reverse their title to become the Irish Labour Party and Trade Union Congress, held their conference in Waterford in 1918, 4 of the women that attended came from the Women Workers' Union. In 1916 and 1917 before it, the only women that had ever attended a congress came from the Women Workers' Union. And now they had doubled their delegation, and 2 other unions had sent women, 2 teachers' unions, 2 delegates from the teachers' unions, and 2 workers from one of the tailoring unions. All but one of these 9 women came from Dublin, and the exception came from Buttevant. It was 21 years since the Irish Congress had come to Waterford. William O'Brien from the Dublin Trades Council took the chair in Waterford, reminding his listeners that 21 years earlier the Irish trade union movement had been a mere stripling beside its older brothers in the worldwide labour movement. And today that stripling has reached manhood, and a vigorous and alert young manhood it is indeed. And this was just about, this was the first kind of time there'd been a substantial kind of number of women sitting in the room. And also 2 years previously, Marie Perrault had actually reminded the trade union movement that they shouldn't kind of constantly use the language of maleness, and that they should always make sure they included "and women" whenever they mentioned that trade union members were men. She, at that time, had been the only woman who had been in the conference hall. New political energies, of course, had been released at this time. Some of them by the events of the Russian Revolution and many of the revolutions and uprising that followed. And also, importantly, very serious challenges to Britain's imperial power in both Egypt and India. And each year in this period, Indian delegates attend the annual congresses and speak to the conference each year from 1920 to 21-22. I think the last time they spoke was in 1922 when Saklat Vala, who was an MP in Westminster, an Indian MP, came over to Ireland to speak. But he'd spoken in Ireland before at another earlier event. Workers' power, which included the vote to all men over 21 that had been granted eventually from Westminster, and even the limited franchise that they had sort of given to women, that 30-year-olds and property owners, and the language of the Soviets from Petrograd to Limerick reinforced this new energy that was at that time. There are two quieter initiatives, but both were significant for women workers. One was the launch under both of them were launched under the sponsorship of the Irish Women Workers' Union. The Irish Nurses' Union began when 20 women met in Dublin in January 1919, and this was the first ever trade union for hospital nurses. Today, the Irish Nurses and Midwives Organisation number 40,000. And if you're thinking about kind of earlier point I was making about family links, there's a quite interesting woman that headed that particular union, Mary Watershed. Her father was Adolphus Shields, who was a well-known journalist and trade unionist, and she had a brother who was an actor at the Abbey Theatre, who was also active out in Easter Week. And another of her brothers, Will, became much better known globally, really, or at least across the Atlantic, as Barry Fitzgerald. The second initiative, though, was less successful. That was a domestic workers section under the direction first of Helena Maloney and then Margaret Buckley. It aimed to introduce training for domestic work, offered registration and an unemployment bureau to regulate the working contracts in which hours, conditions and pay could be more standardised. Nell Regan, who wrote The Life of Helena Maloney, wrote about how Maloney and Theresa Behan, who was another member of the union, relished the relief of paddling their tired feet on the South Dublin beaches after they'd been door-to-door canvassing for members in the domestic workers' union. I'm going to sort of conclude more or less with this one particular episode. This has really just been glimpses, I suppose, of different events. In 1921, women trade unionists, perhaps encouraged by their growing representation within the movement, they'd gone up to approaching 18, I think, delegates at one particular conference, which meant that, you know, that they all had positions within their own unions quite often, went one step further. In a motion to the annual meeting that year, two Dublin women, Sheila Bowen from the newly formed Irish Clerical Workers' Union and Cissy Cahalan of the more venerable Irish Drapers Assistants Association, announced a Labour Women's Council. Both women were seasoned campaigners in suffrage cause, in nationalist and Labour movements. They asked, in the spirit of Labour's commitment to equality, that delegates should give their support to this council and for the executive and affiliates to consult it on all women's issues. Helena Maloney supported the council and insisted that it was nothing to do with separatism. Women weren't equal, and a council would be able to counter that. Of the men who spoke, 8 of them, compared with the 3 women, had 2 responses. Some speakers, the first 2 speakers particularly, Campbell from Belfast said he didn't agree with it, but he did feel very ignorant about the arguments, and so he was prepared to listen. And P.T. Daly just dismissed it, and he dismissed it particularly as somebody who supported women's equality, he said. So they spoke of it as a divisive move, suggesting that equality would be better pursued in mixed organisations, mixed meaning men and women. Others backed a proposal from the secretary of the Labour Party, Tom Johnson, who said he'd never been told anything about this council, but he proposed putting off this suggestion for another 12 months, and everybody, lots of the other men supported that. One man, Brannigan from Dundalk, who worked with linen workers, said he supported the women, particularly because he just knew that they were more inclined if there was a women's organisation to become involved. A short procedural skirmish ended, do we take that as an amendment, or should this be, was it on the floor and everything? So anyway, it ended with a show of hands, and 118 in the hall voted for it, and 36 voted against. But women's attendance and participation in debates was beginning to fall off. Either they were losing interest, or they were just exhausted, because many of them lived quite multiple lives, and these were unbelievably demanding times. I mean, just kind of calling a meeting was a physical kind of huge physical difficulty. Or perhaps they were just not being selected as delegates from their unions. Eventually, the Irish Women Workers Union would be left as the only women's voices left in the hall for decades, really. I haven't really been able to trace the fate of the Labour Women's Council of 1921. Its influence was probably quite limited because the members had to be trade unionists, and most women worked beyond the reach of the unions. The current Labour Women's Council says that it started in 1971, 50 years later. Nevertheless, the effort by women to build their own organisation does suggest that perhaps they felt, although they were being listened to, they were not really being heard. Women had always understood solidarity, and there was very rare, but there wasn't always an opportunity to demonstrate it. Unlike the women's battalion that Emmett O'Connor refers to, of Clonee, the women domestic workers who said they would refuse to work for any strike-bound farmers during the long labourers' disputes in the 1920s. And apparently there was a number of these statements in those at that time. The challenge of women workers in the revolutionary period can be summed up by Sheila Bowen when she made her proposal in 1921. The assertion, she said, of women's views on all questions of a social and public character is essential to the progress of society. I don't know if there's any echoes from that statement, but thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Therese, for that presentation. It was very interesting and informative. And if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask Therese, we can open it up for a brief period. If anybody wants any comment or, yeah, go ahead, Mr. McCarthy.
Therese, 2 questions. You mentioned the ambition with the Federation of Women Workers to get parity with the pay for women in the munitions factory in factories in the UK.
Yeah.
Did they succeed in that?
They did, yeah. In September in 1918, they took a case on behalf of all of the Irish munition workers, and they were raised to that level, yes, on the basis that they should be paid to the same level. And in fact, you've got a number of agreements in different unions and in different situations, sometimes where they began, I mean, for the first time, really, Irish workers were able to compare their wages because there were these bodies that sat, in order to stop strikes during the war. So you get that, like hosiery workers in Blackrock in County Dublin were able to compare their wages to Leicester and say, we should be earning the same. We're both working on government contracts. Why are we not being paid the same? And so a number of kind of advances were made during that war, but time period. One of the problems, of course, was the war ended, and so did a lot of the contracts, and so did the shell factories. And when women who had paid in, because national insurance was already in existence, had paid in their national insurance, and they went to the labour exchanges to find work, were told, well, you can be a domestic worker. And these were women who had worked, that people who had observed their kind of engineering skills, were saying that these women could cut to the finest of, measurements, people that are highly, highly skilled, but just told, go off. And this was you see this undercurrent the whole time, and I'm sure it would have affected a lot of the situation here, would be that as unemployment began to grow into the 1920s, women in particular were told that they could just become domestics. That was all that was. I mean, there was an incident in Belfast where the linen factories had shut in 1921. They had been shut since Christmas, and this guy was meeting in August, the representative, and he was saying that apparently what had happened was, again, these various payments had been made to the women for unemployment, but there was a special one-off payment that came in for 6 weeks, and married women were told if they were living with the husband, they weren't entitled to have it. So this was always being played, this sort of off the unemployment threat.
The second question.
Sorry.
That the conscription crisis, and you had in June you had Law and Amon, the women's
yes,
and certainly in Waterford there's reports of 2,500 ladies parading
yes, I should have.
in absolutely appalling weather conditions, Irish summer, pouring rain. Now, I've never been able to find out how that parade was made up. Did the women parade as trade unions groups, or were it just coming them on and so on like that?
I think a bit of both, really. Yeah. I mean, there was I'd say a lot of the driving behind it was coming them on at that stage. I mean, obviously the labour movement and the unions had been more to the fore before April. But what I know of it was they would have been one of the main forces behind the thing, and I'd say their organisation would have. But they certainly relied on the unions turning out the numbers as well. Yeah. It's very interesting. These. I mean, I didn't actually go into any of that. Which and another thing too was. Organised was the prisoners, the prisoners were on hunger strike in 1920, and the city closed here. They just said, the streets of Waterford were completely empty. There's the days of the strike when that they kind of took in defence of the hunger strikers.
But on that hunger strike and the Soviet and so on like that,
yeah,
you had the English newspapers declaring the Bolshevik menace and the red flag and so on like that. But according to the local newspapers, the workers paraded through the town in the morning time heard speeches, sang the red flag, and then most of them went back to the cathedral where they said the rosary. So it wasn't exactly quite the common image of a Soviet and the Bolshevism, you know. But that's another big
yeah, that's it, yeah.
Well, the anarchists in Andalusia are something similar.
Sorry?
The anarchists in Andalusia were something similar, where they work in the fields and in the evening they go to a church as well.
Yeah. And yeah, the clergy would be very involved in a lot of the trade unions as well, you know, attending and conferences and things like that. Sorry, you were in the back there.
To what extent does the record show in terms of women membership of unions, the drive back into the home, if you like, of women throughout the 20s and into the 30s?
Yeah, 20s and 30s.
Around the country.
Go on, sorry.
You know, does the record show, you know, a decline in women in the workforce after independence and into the early years?
Yeah. I mean, there was such an amazing political energy in the early part of that period, and it's really just driven out, I suppose, to a large extent. I mean, one of the interesting things about emigration is that it's always been very high for women. They kind of tended to leave more often than the men, and the periods that we think of as being terrible for emigration is actually when more men leave than women. You know, the 50s, the 1950s, that was very kind of characteristic, and so, you know, that is always part of the, if you like, the escape hatch of political, and you can almost see it in our own sort of times, that when people could stay at home, the politics began to change, really. And so that was a big problem in the 20s. People could still just about get into the States. I think my mother was told they would, their misfortune was that they'd have to go to perfidious Albion because America was closing the door on immigrants. And so it was just, people would just grow up, you know, knowing that they had to leave in the 20s and 30s, so that the political energies were very sort of evaporated through that process. The other thing, there was obviously quite an intense kind of attitude towards, people going back into the house. And one of the things is that the unions themselves get quite caught up in some of that sort of idea. You know, there's always been this idea that married women shouldn't have to work, and it comes out of all sorts of historic circumstances, but really when it's married women, is what they mean is children, women with children, because in those days, obviously, by default, if you were married, you were more likely to have children than not. And so it's this very uneven and very difficult and awkward conversations that they have about married women working, and then you get I was interested that in this revolutionary period, they're not that interested in how the state is going to control women's work. You know, they don't seem to sort of discuss. They do bring this thing in from the League of Nations that set up with the ILO, set up at the end in the peace. And one of the things is that they want to protect women from hazardous work and various kind of situations. And there's absolutely nobody says a word about it, you know, whether that's good or bad or indifferent. I mean, much later there will be. I mean, I remember Podrigine Namurico, who ran the Women Workers' Union in the last few years of its existence, and sort of saying, you know, well, my members wouldn't thank you for stopping them doing night work, you know, kind of that sort of idea was not an issue then.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, just in terms of, you mentioned energy there, you know, the energy that existed at the time. And how did it manifest itself in terms of militancy? I'm thinking about, you know, over the decades I would have been involved in various campaigns, and I always found that the women who were involved in the campaigns were every bit as kind of bolshy, for want of a better word, in terms of militancy and taking direct action. how did that manifest itself, and what were there records of arrests and charges of criminal damage, affray, all that sort of stuff? It's just, I'm interested in that, given that I know the levels dropped off and with things happened politically then after the Civil War and the conservatism and all that, but is there any figures for, our kind of, were they experiences related that there were certain kind of issues or events that emerged that women kind of took the lead and took a militant role in?
I think I'm probably speaking to the boundaries of my own ignorance on that question. I don't know that there's been that much work done. I know there's some work begun, and partly that's a problem of the records. It's a very slow kind of process trailing through newspapers and trying to find, sort of say, court cases, because unless there's police records in existence, they're difficult to find. And also, sometimes police records can be quite misleading as well, obviously. So that kind of militancy is, I think, where you see it is in some of the manifestations, the demonstrations. I was interested, that kind of image that you were recalling of, the red flag being sung, and that is really kind of being sung all over the place. It's quite interesting when some of the accounts of, for example, when Markowitz comes out of prison and she has this huge reception in the streets, but people talk about flags, but actually there was as many red flags apparently there as there were tricolours. These are the kind of nuances that you miss sometimes unless somebody's really calling your attention to it. And I just came across that reference because the poet Ella Young was a friend of hers, and she mentioned, as a socialist woman, or as she was then, she noticed that, So the militancy I was thinking of was things like, for example, the work that was done in the Sinn Féin elections. The fact that Labour didn't run meant that any women in that sort of socialist sort of coterie of trade union and that, they were going to kind of support, go and campaign for Sinn Féin, that they may have, Markowitz would stand for them. Maybe she would have always stood for them, but it's a very difficult thing to sort of measure, but you can kind of see it in the waves of activity. What you got in 1918 was a whole load of young people in their 20s. Not all of, obviously the women didn't have the vote, but they were sort of out there, and they were able to sort of be on the ground and start kind of the campaign, and gradually, obviously, as the conflict and the military sort of repression grew. I do think it is something that we've never. I've never really felt a lot of accounts that when you read the newspapers, a lot of the books don't really convey the same sense of how difficult life and how repressive life had become. Even before the Rising, you kind of, like if somebody on a railway station told some soldiers to get lost or something, he was arrested under the Defence of the Realm Act and, probably do a prison sentence. It tended to be, no, it didn't tend to be men, actually. Quite a lot of women got done for breaking the Defence of the Realm Act as well, by making past remarks. Say a soldier chats up a young woman and she tells him to get lost. That kind of situation. So, all of that sort of very petty, everyday kind of repression was very. And then once the military comes in, I remember, when I would do work with the National Union of Public Employees, we were working on various projects in history, and I remember, the times that, for example, say those officials had to organise a nighttime meeting in Belfast, in the 70s, was just so difficult. The Women's Committee in Northern Ireland just disappeared because they couldn't organise nighttime meetings for years. And it was kind of took to the mid to late 70s to organise that. Well, imagine when the state of the whole country was like that, and under martial law, these kind of activities became so difficult.
It would be interesting if there were records, really, because when you think of the treaty period and that, women were amongst the most ardent people opposed to the treaty, and so that must have come from a kind of a militancy that had emerged in the previous period, and
their lack of inclusion as well. That sense that they weren't being included in any of the, the league, the women's league in 1917, when they tried to kind of make sure that women's views had a point. I mean, the trade union movement was more receptive to women being allowed to talk, but that in the end, they didn't really. Individual unions changed quite a lot of their women did quite succeed in changing the unions for a while, but by 1920s there was a kind of feeling that a lot of that kind of special pleading was over, and we were now in a period of equality. So we'll get rid of the women's branches, get rid of the women's committees. We'll get in the name of equality. I mean, I don't know whether anybody kind of sounds familiar for the 1990s in some of the unions today, but literally in the name of equality, they got rid of all the women's special kind of pro-women's structures that existed within the trade union movement, and there's always very kind of curious things. You think somebody says something. I remember reading, I think it was Cork University put up this, and the Irish Times carried something about Una Pope Hennessy and her diaries or something, when her visit to Ireland in 1918 or something, and she says, it's so obvious that De Valera is trying to get rid of everything that Connolly signifies out of the movement. And you think, what was that about? What had she seen De Valera doing? It's not that evident, when you read the accounts that he was doing that. It's that was a major motivation for him, and yet this woman had seen something of that. Anyway.
Yes, one at a time. Just take that man there first, please.
Me? I wasn't. Yeah. Just was wondering, was there a higher level of organization amongst women in Waterford, in the area of Waterford?
In where?
Like, was there higher levels of organization amongst women workers in Waterford compared to other kind of urban centres?
I think there was for a period, yes, I think there was. That's something that I haven't really... does the Trades Council have all the records still from that era?
I don't think they have all of them.
Yeah, there would be some, yeah.
Kind of an awareness of the history of women workers in Waterford, a sense of legacy amongst women here.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting when you go to a place that has a history of being well organised. Women, you can kind of still sort of manifest in, as you say, legacy sometimes of the things. And I think women had become very well organised across the board by, quite often through this suffrage, through the nationalist movement, through the trade union movement. There was quite a range really for women to become active in, if you think about it. But I think I don't know enough really to say categorically, but that's a really interesting point that you make.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear me, my voice is so I just want to say it's nice to hear about the struggle for women here in Ireland. It's inspired us as women of colour.
Sorry, I can't quite catch you.
Can't really give you this. This is quite
No, I just wanted to say it's nice to hear about the struggle of women, because as women we are not recognized in this world, and worse and worse. And when we talk about politics and struggle in the past, for example, like where I'm coming from South Africa, you hear people talk about Nelson Mandela. They made him a hero, and they made Winnie Mandela a criminal. And you can't talk about Nelson Mandela without talking about Winnie Mandela. But Nelson Mandela was made a hero, and Winnie Mandela was made a criminal, which is unfair. So I think we need really to recognize women who was the struggle for women and the work they did. You know. It was here is I can see is full of politicians. It's so easy to be talking about women's struggle when we don't even give women a chance. I think it was here in Ireland is things are changing now. We can see women are in politics, but politics in Ireland are dominated by men. It's so easy to say like you support women when you don't give them a chance. Women, they want to see that they've been given a chance. So for example, in a position, you say that you want to support women to lead, but when it comes to there is you want to compete with that woman, why don't you give that woman a chance to lead? I think it's time for not just talking about, okay, we support women in the struggle, but we give them a chance. I think it's time to give women a chance to lead.
I mean, that's an ongoing problem, I think, that kind of question really that you've raised, because none of the women that I've mentioned by name were kind of really timid, or they were, I mean, people like Helena Maloney and that, they were just incredibly bold people. And also I kind of think too of the daily life of a lot of women. I'm sure in all struggles, like they actually kind of carry a lot of the brunt of the sort of day-to-day repression. You know, the raids, the homes are being raided. I mean, the work that young historians are doing today is just almost tipped the balance completely of the way that we look at the struggles of those revolutionary years by, you know, looking at questions of, you know, the fact that the Cumnaman activities were very denigrated and very, you know, they found it very difficult to get their pensions recognised, and maybe if they were out in 16 that might go, but they didn't take into account anything else. I don't think they're always helped by some of the, I don't know, looking at witness statements. And then I kind of think of the sort of men's situation, you know, they don't particularly mention, they talk about coming among girls coming and doing things, and they don't particularly say who they are unless they've run into Madame Markowitz or Helena Maloney or somebody. And you think, well, you know, part of that is kind of comes out of the difficulty of the way that the struggle was organised. You know, you didn't, obviously, if you were sort of on the run, get introduced to everybody that was looking after you, or, you know, if people were delivering food or something to a flying column, you know, but you got this sort of prejudice of the people that were in charge of the pensions or the collecting the witness statements, really, that anything attached to the Irish Citizen Army wasn't the real McCoy. And secondly, if they were female, they really weren't carrying guns, so it didn't really add up to anything. And so the kind of nature of women's struggles itself becomes kind of denigrated, and you know, they would be asked to, I mean, there was always the kind of thing I always think of where the Irish volunteers say in 1913, somebody says, what about the women? Oh, well, there'll also be work for the women to do, you know, and you think, actually, there'll always be work for the women to do. You know, it's the kind of, the cult kind of thing of heroes is a whole other issue too.
Sorry, just when you mentioned about the militancy, Waterford being unique in many ways, there were some very, very militant women supporting the Redmonds. And the two elections, the by-election in March 1918 and the general election, were very hard fought, and among the better fighters were some of the women supporting Captain Redmond. And Dr. White mentioned that the very women that he had treated during the pandemic, during the influenza pandemic in 1918, were among the most vicious opponents who attacked him and etc.
Yeah.
etc. During those. And you know, volunteers for those elections were drafted in from all over the country. And one of them, in his witness statement, who was quite a prominent leader of a flying column in Limerick, noted the effect of the women and said that he would rather spend 6 months on the hills in a flying column. It was much easier than a week electioneering in Waterford, which may be a tribute to the militancy of the women of Waterford.
That lady there first, please. She has her hand up for a while.
Hi, yeah, I just find it interesting, as you said, that, like, that there's always this talk about women working. I mean, you know, I would come from working class family, so I can tell you honestly, I would say most of my females, you know, ancestors all worked. Like, you know, there was never, I mean, both my grandmothers would have worked, and like, I just find that really weird, especially when you're looking at stuff and it's like, you know, works in the home, or, you know, that under, you know, and I know like that my granny, like, one of my grannies who would have been around during that time, she was doing nearly, I would say, about 4 or 5 other jobs, like, to make ends meet. You know, and I just find it really interesting that just gets glossed over, you know, and that we talk about women either being in the workplace or not being in the workplace. And I would say that in many cases, especially with working class women, they never really left the workplace. They were always working, even if they were married. Be it in a domestic situation or otherwise, because there wasn't, you know, it wasn't, being just a housewife was not an option. I just wonder, like, it's why is that we have this idea that women, you know, women working and not working, and I just find that really interesting.
Problems might be to do with the way statistics were sort of kept really in those days. You know, that it would have been maybe demeaning to put down that your wife went out to work. I mean, I just remember that in my own family, not my immediate family, but I remember like a highly skilled sort of boilermaker who was under the impression his whole life that his wife never went to work, although she actually went out and scrubbed floors, you know, at various times and things like that. I mean, it's just, I don't know what the explanation of that is really, but I mean, there is this, you know, there is a whole history of, isn't there, about how, you know, this idea of family wages and all that kind of thing builds in, but.
My father was also a boilermaker, and yeah, that was his liking of alcohol on occasion was the reason, one of the many reasons my grandmother went to work.
But it is, when you look at something like a census, I mean, the blanks for married women with families just leave occupation, you know, completely sort of blank, and then, you know, there is that whole kind of idea, it comes in songs and comes in, you know, that marriage will get you out of this terrible factory, and that, you know, the kind of, the songs of the factory girl are always about marriage sweeping you away from this tyranny or whatever. So there is a sort of something much more complicated, I think, about it.
Interesting to talk about women being like, I don't think even my mother, even though she would have spent more time at home than her mother, I could completely see as being a housewife all the time either.
I think one of the things as well, and particularly this time, and you've kind of raised it really, is that sort of whole issue of class in regard to some of the women as well. You know, the idea that the Shawleys were the people that came out in support of Redmond, or you have the, you know, the separation women who just spend all this money getting drunk in the pubs instead of, when the men are away fighting. And in fact, the Dublin Castle has inquiries into, is there more drunkenness? I mean, are women kind of spending more time in the pubs now, and also what's really interesting, if you look at something like a lot of working class households, I mean, if you look at a separation allowance, it's kind of pretty good money compared to what a lot of men would be bringing home to a family, because there would be money for each child. I think it was something like 12 and 6, and then a kind of a increment for each child or something. I'm not sure.
Well, to give an example of the figures, a labourer in Waterford, we say just before the war, if he was lucky enough to get work 6 days a week, he took home about 18 shillings. Let's say he was married with 3 or 4 kids. When he went off to war, she got 24 shillings a week, and she didn't have to feed, water or clothe him out of that. So there were significant gains on it. And you get the then Catholic Bishop of Waterford calling on the corporation and the education committee to bring in classes to teach the women how to handle, quote, their newfound wealth, unquote, on that. And one example of the newfound wealth and how they used it, I remember my grandmother telling me that about a neighbour of hers whose husband was in the army. She was doing well out of the separation money. And in 1917, this woman went up to the parish priest of Ballybricken and gave him a shilling to say mass for the health of the Kaiser, that the war would last. He took the shilling and said he would say mass for the health of all of those involved in the fighting.
Wasn't there a parish priest in Ballybricken as well who gave out about the separation women that are having too good a time?
Oh yeah, like kind of the diocesan Lenten, the diocesan, and just not the Diocese of Waterford and Lismore, but the Lenten pastoral for 1915. My God, you'd think these people were having a ball, morning, noon and night, on that, and the call, as I say, to educate and how to spend their newfound wealth and so on like that.
Newfound wealth. And also, if the man in the house was working, he would be the best fed person in the house. So presumably if he was away in the army, people could, the dip in the dip and keep the herring for your father kind of was not, didn't have to be obeyed any during that period too. So people probably ate better for the first time.
As we say down this neck of the woods, they didn't have to give him, he didn't have to get a few bob every week for a few bottles,
We're still looking for that few bob every week. I was just wondering, if I could, John, just on the religious thing that we just touched on. As the women were moving out of the munitions factories and the various other factories that were going around at wartime and almost heading back into the homes, did the Catholic Church, and I'm imagining they did, but I'm just wondering, is it recorded that they had some influence in that the woman's place was in the home, the emergency was over, and so you're not needed now out of these manly activities, that your place is back home, either having children or minding the children that's there. Did that feed into the whole drop of the women in the workforce more back into domestic, or not even working domestically, but just living in their houses? Because the church, as we all know, had a huge influence in this country. So I'm wondering, did the bishops and so on put pressure on women at the time? Look, your place is now back inside the doors. Let everything else to the men. Was that a theme at the time?
I think there would be elements of it, but again, I wouldn't know enough really to be able to say. But that kind of, the Lenten pastorals were very powerful, and they were very socially oriented too at that time. Well, not just at that time, but generally. I mean, there was that kind of sense of you get far more kind of priests taking part in the whole sort of debate about poverty and social justice and things like that. Not necessarily from the side of the workers, if you like, but it becomes a kind of it has become a clearly something. And then, eventually, of course, when you go on to sort of people like McQuaid and that, I mean, he is actually building up a parallel state. So he has that kind of ideology, like there are cinemas in the town, but the Catholic Church sets up the Irish Film Institute, and all of this. It's actually almost anything that happens in sort of civil society, he has a parallel for and things. So there is that kind of sense that and I'm sure much more work needs to be looked at, but I think that's a really important point, that people, we need to look much more at what's being said locally at these in these circumstances, and the general pressure that would be put on people. I mean, economic pressure was usually stronger than that, but there would be elements, and I mean, there's certainly we know, that in other social circumstances, the church's power could overreach any other temporal power, including the family.
Just on that point, surely it's the end of the war economy that is taking women out of the factories, not just in Ireland, but all across Britain, America,
And then you get the marriage bars and everything comes in.
Bella de Welder, she sent home from the factories in Glasgow at the end of the Second World War. All that type of stuff.
Yeah.
Or even in America, Roosevelt led a chair.
Rosie the Riveter.
The veterans of the First World War, protesting over having no work. In Washington. But I just wanted to come back to the point Pat was making about the feral Redmonites.
Oh yeah.
That I see a version of it myself later, many years later. Their daughters or granddaughters over in the station, when Gareth Fitzgerald travelled in for his whistle stopped Europe Ireland's railway stations, and there was a black flag protest. I don't know if it was the first or second election during that period, but the black flag protest was going on, and Garrett was giving his speech from the train, and all the women from Ballybricken and that were there, and as the train was about to leave, tensions increased, and the guards put out a big line, strong young men, to keep the forces apart, and they were attacked by the women from Ballybricken with umbrellas and venom I've never seen in my life since, even on picket lines and stuff that goes. But they were as feared as you could get. But I always remember, as the train was leaving the station, Gareth was waving out saying goodbye to the crowd, and he had two special branchmen, one holding him by the neck and by a leg each, and he was waving back like that, and they were watching the black flag protest. And as soon as they got to the protest, they went back into the train. But I definitely attest to the nature of the women that are Redmonites.
That's also quite a recurrent theme in those kind of confrontations, isn't it? You often see, the women just behaved appallingly, or they were by far the worst, or that's interesting. Witness.
Gareth Fitzgerald told me a story. I met him at a conference in 2009, and we were chatting about the 1918 election and the sweep of Sinn Féin, and I pointed out that it didn't work everywhere. Waterford was true to the Redmonds. And he told me that in 1966, as a newly elected young senator, there was a by-election in Waterford. And he came down, his first time to visit Waterford for electioneering purposes. And he's told where to canvass. And from his description, it was Francis Street, just off Ballybricken. And he knocks at the front door, and he's wearing this big rosette, vote Eddie Collins, vote Fine Gael. And the woman opens the door, and she looks at him, looks at the rosette, and then looks at him again between the eyes and says, "You needn't worry, sir, we always vote Redmond in this house." They were still voting Redmond.
It's very strong, isn't it?
The opportunity for women to work, surely was determined by underdevelopment in the country, as a result of British imperialism down through the decades, and the opportunity for we didn't develop in the same way an industrial economy like the north of Ireland or parts of Britain. So a lot of women emigrated as a result of it. I think I saw a figure there at one stage that said that really down the west coast, that the amount of women that were there, that really you had enforced celibacy of large numbers of men who ended up as relatives assisting on farms because of the structure of who inherited the farm. But the lack of women that were there because they went to England. And it's be interesting to see what the in the north of Ireland, which of course had a different setup after 1922, how that developed in terms of women's involvement in trade unions up there and against the Republic. Just to say that the marriage bar lasted up to 1975, and it was a case taken by water crystal workers to the Labour Court that actually abolished it. Now, it was done so on the basis that the Labour Court did it because EU were going to rule anyway to abolish it. You know, that's how far it went back.
Yeah.
That's how recent it is.
Yeah, and it's often overlooked that a lot of industrial places had marriage bans. People think it just was the civil service or it was teachers or something, but yeah. I mean, I remember somebody talking about Gallagher's in a factory in Belfast too. You know, there was a marriage ban. If you got married, you had to leave your job and everything. And obviously, you know, comes out of when work was in very short supply, that any way of kind of sort of peeling people off in that kind of sense of...
I think too, like, you know, you can't... Ireland developed in a different trajectory to a lot of European countries and even Britain. We didn't have a social democratic party here. Okay, maybe you could say that maybe you could put that broad term on Fianna Fáil at one stage. But we didn't have a left-right divide in the country in terms of that, and we had a peculiar situation in Waterford altogether, where you had the tradition of voting strongly for Redmond and for business people. You know, he wasn't exactly a big supporter of trade unions, and you had that sort of work sort of situation throughout the country. Like, we didn't have that. We've only, I mean, it's only in the recent election that we've seen that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael had to come together to form a government. Up to 15 years ago, they were getting 80% of the vote between.
And the politics of an area would also affect emigration too, that if, you know, if Fianna Fáil was in, you weren't going to get work if you were Fine Gael or vice versa. You know, the way post offices kept changing as to when governments changed, the person that was the main post office, sometimes in rural places, would become, you know, they would change, somebody different according to the politics. And I know, you know, like in my mother's family, they kind of knew that they just had to emigrate because, I think it was the wrong side of the Civil War. It was going to be, you know, somewhere else, and people going off to America as well, you know, earlier than that. But people going to, I mean, everybody emigrated in her family.
Any more questions or anybody else? Any comments? Well, thanks, Therese, for coming down. Do you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to hear what we're looking for information about McCarthy woman. I can give you some information about that.
Say that again.
You know, you're looking for the union person. I can give you information about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So to thank everybody very much for your contributions. Have been really interesting and kind of made me kind of think of a whole other aspect of really kind of taking this question on, and particularly the Waterford experience. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Therese. Thanks everybody for attending.
Yeah, thanks.